Innovations Podcast for Saturday, April 22nd, 2006. Show number 52, coming to you from Sacramento, California. Welcome to the Killer Innovations Podcast. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. Please keep in mind that the information and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and mine alone, and do not necessarily reflect those of my past, current, or future employers. Well, thanks for joining this week's podcast. I'm in Sacramento. My son has a fencing competition, so my wife and I are here in Sacramento watching him compete. Let's see. I'll be in Las Vegas this coming week for the National Association of Broadcasters Convention. So if you're going to be in Las Vegas, drop me an email and let's see if we can't get together. I will only be in Las Vegas on Tuesday, so we would need to find a time on that date. But drop me an email and we'll see. I know there's a few of the podcasters have already contacted me, so we're going to be trying to see if we can't find a convenient time to do a meetup. If you want to know where I'm going to be coming or where I'll be appearing with other speeches and events, please visit the killerinnovations.com website. You can click on the events button and it'll tell you when I'll be appearing. For those of you who are planning on attending the Kansas City event at the end of the month, that event has been rescheduled to June. I will be posting a new date when that comes up. So the sample Killer Innovations workshop activity that was planned for Kansas City at the end of April has been moved out till June. Keep the feedback coming. You can send me an email at podcast@killerinnovations.com. You can also leave me a voicemail feedback line at 703-636-4460. You can also Skype me at Phil_McKinney. If you are a member of the LinkedIn Business Social Network, feel free to send me an invite. Please, in the invite, identify yourself as a podcast listener, and I'll accept that invite under LinkedIn. And the LinkedIn email, you can use the podcast at Killer Innovations for that invite. The work schedule is still tough. I'm still doing 2 jobs, so I'm a little behind on the email response and commenting on the KI Community Board. Chris Woodruff has stepped in. As many of you, the regular listeners know, Chris is one of the moderators on the KI community site. And I've noticed that Chris has stepped in and continues to help drive the conversation. Sign up for the RSS feed so you can keep track of the conversations that are going out there. And I just want to extend my appreciation to Chris and all of the members of the KI community site for participating and responding to listeners' questions and comments. If you'd like to take on a moderator role on the KI community site, send me an email and tell me the specific area of the site that you would like to moderate and why you're interested in that particular subject, and we'll get that set up. Okay, this show, just as a heads up, is probably going to be a little bit shorter than normal. I'm trying to squeeze this in here while I'm in Sacramento, so I never quite know when I've got to get off and run over to watch my son compete. So If there's dropouts in the middle of this show, you'll understand why. Okay, today's show, segment 1, talking about the return of the lone inventor. For those of us who participate in what I would call the corporate America, let's say the Fortune or Global 500 companies, R&D funding is continuing to be under downward pressure. Many companies are trying to get better return out of those investments. And as a result, many companies are looking outside of their corporate R&D for really that next great idea. If you're not familiar, Procter & Gamble is probably one of the leaders in this area. A number of good examples from P&G around looking outside of its out of its own corporate R&D and looking for new kinds of new products, or actually to solve very specific programs. So, for instance, Procter & Gamble, there's an article that I've read that was talking about that P&G had a team and they were having trouble devising an anti-wrinkling coating that consumers could apply to cotton clothes. They had a hard time inventing it themselves. Their head of R&D for the fabric unit had tried to develop in-house, but then came to the conclusion that they probably should go outside. So P&G turned to a company called 9 Sigma, which is basically what I would call an innovation sourcing firm based in Ohio. And what they do is they have a list of about 6,000 individual inventors and small businesses, and they blast out these requests out to all 6,000. Now, these individual inventors and small companies, basically their objective is that they would like to get a contract. Well, in this case, Procter & Gamble received back 18 replies, companies that either had interest in helping to develop it or may already have that solution sitting in their labs or through their own R&D organizations that could be leveraged. And as a result, Procter & Gamble actually signed 2 contracts. And this is really being driven by the fact that the responsibility for inventing new products is shifting from corporations to entrepreneurs. If you think about the total R&D spending, industrial R&D spending has been on a continual slide. In 2000, corporate spending was about $185 billion. Over the next 5 years, that has slid to $173 billion. And along with that comes with government R&D funding is also continuing to be under very intense pressure. If you're not familiar with a company called Chai Research, I've actually talked about this company in the past. Chai Research goes through and looks at patents and looks at the value of patents. Well, Chai did this research looking at tracking what they call the highly innovative firms. And they've identified that there's about 1,270 highly innovative firms. These are firms not by the number of patents that you create, but by how many of those patents are referenced by other patents. So therefore, if your patent is very important and is a key, what we call prior art, your patent gets listed or commented by others. Now, the interesting statistic here is that of those 1,270 highly innovative firms, you would think that this list would contain all of the big firms that are out there. It's interesting to know that there's clearly a shift in that mix. In 2000, of those 1,270 highly innovative firms, 33% of them were small businesses. Within the next 2 years, that number has jumped to 40%. Of those highly innovative firms are small businesses. And my prediction is that number is going to continue to grow. Now, it's interesting to recall the fact that it used to be that the Census Bureau actually had an occupation that was listed as inventor. Now, for those of you listeners who are individual inventors, and I know there's many of you out there, I know when you go to like coffee parties or talk with your friends or your next door neighbors and they ask you what you do when you say inventor, you typically get the look that says, okay, that's a guy who couldn't probably get a real job. But I'm just here to say that I think the role of individual inventors and small companies who are solely focused on inventing is really at the early stages of becoming really the key success factors for the overall economy in generating new kinds of ideas. Now, the average R&D spending for, let's say, for Procter & Gamble, you can actually look at their P&L. The R&D spending for Procter & Gamble, which is actually one of the most creative R&D organizations out there, has gone from 4.5% of sales down to 3.5% of sales. But to counteract the decreased spending on their own R&D spend, they have increased the share of ideas and products that they're going to get from the outside. And over that same time frame, they've gone from only getting 20% of their ideas from the outside to now getting 35% of all the new products that Procter & Gamble introduces from outside small firms and innovations. And actually, their objective is to get that number to be 50%. So 50% of everything that Procter & Gamble gets and launches as far as new products coming from outside individual inventors and small businesses. Now, there's another firm that's out there that's trying to create kind of what I would call a free market opportunity to make it easier for small inventors to be able to plug into this economy and be able to create a business, something that you could actually support yourself and your family. And one is called Innocentive, which is actually founded by the pharmaceutical companies. Now, Innocentive has more than 70,000 registered solvers from 173 countries. Now, the key enticement here for these companies is that they can get a prize anywhere ranging from $10,000 to $100,000 award for coming up with solving a very specific problem. And most of the problems that get posted on Incentives is really in the chemistry space, particularly for pharmaceuticals. So they need to solve a particular chemical process or a chemical manufacturing process. And so far, more than 35 companies are participating in the Innocentive market from the standpoint of posting their needs and getting inventors and universities to respond and to enable them to find those problems being solved by small inventors and small companies. There's another example of just the individual inventor who may not even realize that they want to be an inventor. There's a trend that's emerging where you're seeing, people just solving their day-to-day problems. They come up with a solution and then wonder if that solution could potentially be the big blockbuster winner. One example is Jennifer Sarahan, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, who is a mother of 3 in Ohio. In early 2003, she decided to take a stab at inventing basically a plastic cutting device that could remove the bread crusts and cut the sandwiches in half all in one motion. Now, here's a mother with a clear objective of making her life easier. But she was really kind of a loss of what to do with this invention that she called Good Bites. Then she learned of an organization, or really a company called Mom Inventors. And this is a company that basically licenses mom-made inventions and sells them over the web and through a network of stores. Now, this company, Mom Inventors, has licensed this particular product for a standard licensing royalty of around 5%. And they predict that the product, together with 2 other that Mom Inventors have signed up, is going to bring in roughly $1.7 million this year. Now, this is clearly a niche approach, but individual inventors who are solving their own personal problems, if you solve your own problem, and if it's a real problem or a real boost to your own personal productivity, then you need to potentially take a look at how do you then partner with these large corporations. Can you, as a lone inventor, get somebody interested in potentially licensing your technology? Now, at the same time, when I'm talking about this resurgence of individual inventors and really this drive towards larger corporations looking to acquire or invest or license technologies, one of the key tactics that large corporations will use is just straight out acquisitions. And if you look at kind of the statistic that says, how many of these small acquisitions and what we call the sub $50 million acquisitions. So these are the acquisitions that large corporations go off and buy a company. And in a sub $50 million acquisition, now for some of you that may sound like a large number. For those of us who deal in the Fortune 100 companies, looking at inventors and looking at inventions, it's really a fairly small amount. But if you look at the number of sub $50 million acquisitions, that number has absolutely exploded. In 1995, there were a total of 322 sub $50 million acquisitions. By 2004, that has exploded to 1,400. And that's just one of the indications of the corporation's interest in, rather than funding their own R&D or continuing to increase the R&D spend, reallocate potentially some of those funds to go out and find small, either companies or individual inventors who've come up with something really breakthrough and acquire that rather than funding multi-year R&D in hopes that they come up with that next great killer idea. So, for those of you who are listeners who are those individual inventors or small companies where you think you want to go out into the marketplace and really be that individual inventor and really go out there and create a living, look at the statistics out there. I would encourage you to think about the opportunities as being a small company and being the source of ideas for those large corporations. However, you need to get yourself plugged in. You need to make the large corporations aware of your existence and your expertise and what your capabilities are. There are the emergence of these websites like Incentives and others that will play kind of the broker or matchmaker between the large corporations looking for ideas or solving a particular problem and plugging in potential inventors who can potentially solve those problems. So if you're looking, you want to become that inventor, you feel like you want to step out and be the next Thomas Edison, now is probably one of the best times in the marketplace as we make this shift from an information or knowledge economy to a creative economy. But make sure that you know how to plug yourself in and make potential corporations aware of what you can do to solve their problems today. Moving on to segment two. Segment two is about what I would call wicked innovations. Now, what do I mean by a wicked innovation? Now, these are those innovations that we would tend to call really, pains. These are things that are actually being done deceptively. One example is things like spam, like phishing emails that you get to log you into a fake site to reveal personal information and to get, and therefore do identity theft. Viruses that are sent as email attachments that you then click on and inadvertently infect your machine. Now, typically we would view these things as just being totally a waste of time, that they would be destructive, and that's why I would call these things wicked innovations. But they are innovations in their own right. Now, if you can disconnect yourself from all of the frustrations we have, and you look really at the analysis of these innovations, they, in many cases, are some of the most successful innovations ever. They've utterly transformed the network experience. They're global, meaning that if you look at a lot of the viruses, and particularly the phishing sites, they're coming from Africa, Russia, China, and other places. At the same time, they're local. We've seen the high profile where you got very creative high school kids, college kids, working on these next kind of what I would call wicked innovations. They're persistent. They're not going to go away. They keep trying. They keep finding the better way. They're pervasive. They cleverly exploit both human and technical weaknesses. They figure out how to put the title in there. They figure out how to create the email to make you really think that that's an email from Citibank, when in reality it's somebody that is just trying to steal your information. But why do these innovations succeed? And what can and should we learn from their continued success? And these are good questions. These are questions that we should be, it doesn't matter whether you agree with the innovation or disagree with the innovation. And I'm trying to remember whether or not I've talked about this in the podcast, but, another one, what I would call, and this is, personal preference, you may not agree, but another area of wicked innovation is things like the overall, explosion of pornography. Now, whether or not your personal belief is about pornography is actually a very good source of future innovations. Many people think that Gutenberg created movable type to print the Bible, but one of the things that movable type enabled to happen was the printing of dirty stories, and it became a big, huge business. The videotape market would never have succeeded, and the price of VHS recorders would not have dropped had it not been for the availability of pornography. Pornography was the one that drove market success for VHS. Pornography was were the first in the industry to create voice over IP, not as a phone call, but for the whole experience of having the web experience with pornography. Webcams, they were the ones that solved content streaming. In fact, the research that goes on within the pornography industries are some of the best research around copyright protection and watermarking of video and photos. So there are a lot of wicked innovations, whether it's spamming, whether it's phishing, whether it's viruses, pornography, whatever you would classify in your own mind as wicked. But these are potentially sources of ideas on how you can counteract these wicked innovations, and this creates value. And you really need to rethink the whole role of competition with these things around the wicked innovation. There are basically two kinds of innovators that stand out. You can choose as an innovator to either be what we call a compete with each other, and that is they respect certain rules in the efforts to succeed in the marketplace. They're just, this is kind of like the polite battles that we used to see in medieval times. People would line up. There were certain processes and certain agreed upon activities. Compete against innovators whose goal is to spread their own innovation and eliminate their competition. Free choice in the marketplace be damned. Compete with innovation is about value creation. Compete against innovation is about value negation, getting rid of the value of your competitors in order for you to dominate the marketplace. When you think about wicked innovations tend to be compete against innovations. And so therefore, when you think about, they don't play by the same rules. The phishing guy is not going to play by the rules. The spam and virus people are not going to play by a certain set of accepted rules in society. So rather than thinking about, like Symantec and the other companies that have been out there trying to counteract these things, and thinking about the normal rules of engagement, in many cases, when you think about how to solve or how to out-innovate these guys, is you got to understand what drives their motivation and what drives their decision-making process. The compete against dynamic is an escalating innovations arm race. And basically, the economic goal is less to create new value for customers than to defeat or hoodwink or deceive, the enemy. In this case, deceive the customers out of their money, or deceive them into basically turning their laptop or their PC into a zombie machine that they can then exploit to do more harm. And basically, it's around deceit and deception and misrepresentation. And this is the whole focus for these compete against innovations. Now, should compete with innovators fight fire with fire and use deceptions, to basically beat these guys? Should they give their customers and clients better tools to battle these kind of innovations, or should we simply just throw up our hands and declare wicked innovations as a public policy issue and count on regulators, courts, and legislators to rescue us? Should we fight fire, meaning we compete in the same way we do innovate against kind of a model against these guys, against the wicked innovations? Well, really, the correct answer is really all of the above. Honesty does compel us to admit that dishonesty is often a superb innovation strategy. And in many cases, you have to be deceptive. There are tools that the security companies put out there to basically deceive the virus guys into revealing who they are. Is that an appropriate approach? You betcha. So we have to grow ever smarter and, to do our own understandings of how they think and how they operate and the kind of inventions that they create, and how do we counteract and protect our own machines and protect our families and protect our businesses. Wicked compete against innovators. Ironically, inevitably, will increasingly drive innovation in compete with markets. Now, we think that they're negative, but when you really understand the history, they actually do create value. Now, if you think back just on the computer viruses, the first viruses came out in 1986 and 1987. At that point in time, I was actually working for a company that developed fingerprint biometric scanners, a company called ThumbScan. And we actually got involved in doing analysis on some of those early viruses that were running around. And really, this is pre-internet, but this was basically sneaker nets. People would create this virus and literally walk into a computer store. At that time, computer stores like Computer Land. Now I know I'm really dating myself. And walk in and stick a floppy in. And this was quite common practice because there were just so few computers that people would actually go to computer stores, and I would stick my floppy in and copy my program onto your floppy at a store, and that's how people would exchange or share software in the early days. Well, the early developers of viruses figured out that they could take these viruses, put them onto a hard disk at a computer land, and enough people would come in every day who would inadvertently get their files infected and carry it back to their own machines. And so I had either the fortunate or unfortunate experience of actually being called in to help try to identify and understand viruses, and was working with a professor called by the name of Dr. Cohen at University of Cincinnati. Cohen actually did his PhD thesis on computer viruses, and it's pretty much the shot heard around the world, because in that PhD thesis, Cohen actually wrote some of the very first viruses and kind of revealed some of the nomenclature that is still in existence today. Now, the result of that is that we were trying to solve the problem without the understanding of creating value. Other companies, however, figured out how to create their own value in the form of creating tools against these wicked innovations. So things like Symantec, Norton Utilities, the firewall companies, etc. These are all companies that were able to create value by looking at these wicked innovations and coming up with a solution, and a solution that the market was willing to pay for. So the single most important lesson about these kind of wicked innovation it teaches is that the economics of cheating plays as great a role in defining value as the economics of adoption. And it's just something that we have to recognize. But looking at wicked innovations, things that we tend to think of as just things that just get in our way, and our problems are either negative influences on families or attempts to try to harm your business, these potentially are sources of early weak signals that you can look at in order to create value that can solve the problem. So moving on to segment 3, the killer question of the week. Now, this week's killer question is linked to segment number 2. So this week's killer question is, what compete against wicked innovation exists, and what can I create to counter their success and create value? So again, what compete against wicked innovation exists, and what can I create to counter their success and create value? So just as I said in the previous example with computer viruses, hindsight's 20/20, but in 1986, when I was working on some of the early work in computer virus research, had I figured it out and understood the role of wicked innovations and what you could do to create value around preventing those wicked innovations from being successful, maybe I could have created the next Peter Norton or Symantec or firewall company. So hindsight's 2020, but here's your opportunity. So again, this week's killer question is, what compete against wicked innovation exists, and what can I create to counter their success? So with that, thanks for listening. We're coming up right on 30 minutes. As we move into May, the Killer Innovation Podcast may skip a few weeks here or there. In May, I have 2 of my kids graduating from college, and my oldest daughter is getting married. So there's a lot going on. In addition, we're relocating from Washington, D.C. to the San Francisco Bay Area. So nothing like a little stress in your life to keep the adrenaline pump going. But keep the feedback coming. Send me an email at podcast@killerinnovations.com. Send me a voicemail at 703-636-4460. And visit the KI community site. Send in your questions or ideas for upcoming shows. So I'm putting together kind of a longer list of topics for upcoming shows. If you have ideas or you have questions, please send them to me, and we'll add those to the list for an upcoming show. Keep subscribed. Get others to subscribe. Pass the word to your coworkers about the KI podcast. And thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.